Dear Jim Reed, welcome to the Prokhorov Centre. Let's start the interview with your background. You've been at Oxford for a long time, but you're not from Oxford originally.
No, well, a long time. I went up as an undergraduate in 1957, which is already history and some. But I come from southeast London originally, but I spent 7 years of my early youth in Lancashire, and that was learning my first foreign language. Learning to pronounce things in the northern way, which I can still do if I want to.
And you studied at Oxford from when till when?
Undergraduate course was just 3 years. I didn't go abroad for a year. That wasn't the thing that people did in those days. And having done your national service, you didn't want to spend more time than you had to. So I just did the 3 years, 1957 to 1960. And then I started graduate work on the thesis, which I never finished. I got a job in 1963, and in those days faculties didn't insist on you finishing your doctorate once you had a job. They just hoped that you would go on doing something useful.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Was Oxford in those very different from what it is now?
Well, for graduates it was very different in the sense that there was very little competition. I mean, people could get a first-class degree to their own surprise, announced at the end of July, and decide to go back and do research, and there was always a grant. I mean, there was no pressure on graduate places, there was no problem about getting a scholarship, a graduate scholarship. So the situation was very undramatic in those days, and I made various acquaintances, contemporaries of mine, and we all got jobs more or less at the same time. There was no tremendous pressure on jobs. Of course, that was a time when universities were expanding, new universities being founded, so there were jobs going for people in modern languages with successful careers. Sometimes people who had even got a particularly outstanding first degree managed to get jobs and then had distinguished careers afterwards. So
what about the teaching? Has that changed a lot in terms of the way it's being done, or in terms of the content?
No, I mean, teaching, the tutorial system has remained unchanged, and still, I think, as efficient as ever. I mean, it is, of course, a system nobody would ever invent nowadays because it's so labour intensive. If you're teaching students singly or in pairs, compared with seminars in larger groups, it's very labour intensive, and that means you have to have a lot of people employed. So colleges all have their tutors in the various subjects. For a subject like history, there will be 2 or 3 tutors, and for chemistry, there will be 2 or 3 tutors. Then for modern languages, there will be 1 tutor in each language, either a fellow of the college or a lecturer for the college who is a fellow elsewhere. So it is still very much a labour-intensive business, and still a very personal business. So that if you're my pupil, over 3 years, I chose you out of the applicants. I'm responsible for your progress. I keep a close eye on you. If you start falling behind with your work or anything, if you have personal problems, it shows immediately. So there's a very strong pastoral element as well in the tutorial system.
What about the content? Because Oxford has always focused fairly heavily on the canon of German literature.
Yeah.
Do you see that as an advantage or sometimes as a straitjacket?
Well, no, I don't think it's at all a straitjacket. I mean, we keep on moving with the times, so that the selection of authors you can study in detail for a term goes on growing. So contemporary authors get in there. The period of literature extends up to the present. On the other hand, at the other extreme, we're quite strong in medieval studies. We still have medievalists. In post, the professor of medieval literature, Nigel Palmer, retired, and he is now being replaced by Henk Lindemann. So that's maintained. We have a representation of Baroque, so we have a complete coverage. I think it's good that at least one university in the country manages to sustain the whole programme, the complete culture. Where most people in other universities are pressured to reduce things, to keep to the more marketable sections, and you can't necessarily persuade the authorities that medieval literature is a marketable product.
Yeah. And with a focus on the greats of German literature, Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, those are authors that you've worked on as well. I think Goethe, Schiller and Thomas Mann are probably your 3 main foci. Is there anything that unites these authors, you think, either politically, philosophically, as writers?
Well, I think quality is the answer to that. That they are all major writers in the sense that they write superbly well and that their works are canonical and not without reason. But I mean, I don't think, when I was an undergraduate, you virtually doing German couldn't avoid doing Goethe, and you finished up doing a whole term on him. But now he floats free as part of the market, and people choose him or choose Kafka. I mean, Kafka is big, of course, with the young, who are fascinated by things that nobody understands. And Thomas Mann still maintains his position quite well. But then we have Günter Grass and later writers who creep into the selection. So we don't stand still. We are flexible. We move with the times and offer the students a wide variety which they can freely choose from.
Unfortunately, there won't be time to tackle all three authors, Goethe, Schiller and Thomas Mann. So let's stick with the greatest of them, Goethe. And let's start from Schiller's distinction between naive and sentimentalische Dichtung. Schiller describes himself as a sentimental poet and Goethe as a naive poet. Can you explain, first of all, what he means by that, and second, what do you think, does that distinction actually hold? Because Goethe, Schiller sees himself as sentimental and Goethe as naive. Does that work? That would be the second question.
Well, you may be interested to know that essay, the Naive or Sentimentalische Dichtung, was part of the prescription for the first year for the preliminary examination, so we were really thrown in at the deep end. And it has been very dear to my heart ever since, because it seems to me to be one of the great attempts to see clearly through the thicket of literature what really determines what is written and how it's written. Schiller's idea is partly typological, but partly also historical, in that the naivety that he postulates starts with the Greeks, but it also is represented by particular types, and Goethe is a kind of survival of a naive not in any pejorative sense, of course, but naive meaning really spontaneous and able to create out of the personality without a lot of prior reflection. Schiller is very aware of his own very reflective nature, and reflective is quite a good translation for sentimentalisch. It's the difference really between primal and fallen. I mean, there's a kind of analogy with the theological notion of the state before the fall and the state after the fall. And the fall, of course, is the fall into consciousness and self-consciousness and reflexiveness, which is not so much an aid to the writer as something that he has to cope with, because he has to try and get out of it so as to create. He has to try and get away from excessive self-consciousness so as to be able to produce anything. And something I mentioned in my lecture last night, that people like Schiller and Flaubert are famous for having been impeded by their own consciousness. So the reflective writer has all the advantages of extra complexities, but then he has to cope with them as possible potential obstacles to his creative process.
You see Goethe, tell me if I'm wrong, you see Goethe as essentially a happy writer, as someone who's in final analysis at peace with the world, is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, when I wrote a little book for the Past Masters series on Goethe, the last chapter is called A Happy Constellation, and it goes back to Goethe's statement about the constellation of stars at the time he was born, but also the notion of happiness, the notion of being at home in the world. And a much more recent paper on Goethe and Kant emphasizes that certain people are at home in the world. They feel integrated, they feel harmonious within it, not in any facile way, because there are all sorts of problematic things that any individual has to deal with, but still ultimately positive about the real world, positive about the processes of nature, positive about his own position within those, his own belonging to the nexus of organic nature. So naive in a very, very high-powered sense.
Yes, yeah. I'm very tempted to ask you about Hegel here, because I think Hegel has essentially the same access to the world, a kind of acceptance and feeling at home in the world, in spite of its many imperfections. But I'm not going to go there, because I know that we shan't agree.
We should end up fighting. Yes, we mustn't fight on camera.
So instead, maybe you can elaborate a little further on what you've just said about Goethe by talking about these two fragments.
Well, I mean, these are famous.
So one
is Hamlet talking about Yorick. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well. And the other is Goethe writing a poem about a skull which was dug up in Weimar in the 1820s, and which he believed at the time, though he may be wrong, was Schiller's skull. Schiller had been buried and then reburied, and it was all very complicated, and people have tried all sorts of ways of checking whether was the genuine skull, but the real thing that matters is a genuine poem based on the notion that it is Schiller's skull. And the very radical difference between Hamlet looking at Yorick's skull and Goethe looking at Schiller's skull is that the Hamlet passage, Shakespeare, Hamlet is horrified by death. He's horrified by the skull, and it makes him, in a sense, kill off again poor Yorick. He is horrified at the notion of the live Yorick, and his memories of the live Yorick are horrible to him because he now has the skull in his hands. Whereas in Goethe's case, the skull is an inspiration to think back to what a magnificent friend, creator, poet Schiller was, and to celebrate it. So you get a completely different angle. Shakespeare, if not Shakespeare, then certainly Hamlet as imagined by Shakespeare is entirely negative, and Goethe, contemplating Schiller's remains, is entirely positive. And talking about being at home in the universe, I mean, that is part of it, to be able to be positive about what a man was, rather than being horrified at the thought of the living man just because you've got the dead remains in your hand.
Yeah.
I mean, Goethe was obsessed with Shakespeare. He was deeply influenced by Shakespeare, particularly in his early writing, and kept on coming back to him, and in a sense was always looking over his shoulder at Shakespeare and wanting to be, to some extent, on a level with Shakespeare, but modestly always thinking that Shakespeare was absolutely the very tops, which you can't quite aspire to. But in respect of attitudes to life, I mean, we don't know what Shakespeare's attitude to life was. We can't equate Shakespeare with Hamlet, but still Goethe has got something to say which goes well beyond what Shakespeare makes Hamlet say.
They're very different sensibilities, aren't they, expressed in these two bits of text?
I mean, Hamlet is very much a Baroque piece. You know, Baroque, the dominance of the obsession with death, the obsession with the welfare of the soul, whereas Goethe ultimately, and this is very important in my view, Goethe is the first great secular writer, completely secular, who gets out from under the tradition of Christian thought and begins a tradition of Diesseitigkeit, of attachment to this world, without the hang-ups that go with transcendent views.
Yeah, because Goethe, looking at Schiller's skull, then for him that's a way into life. Whereas then the fragment about that Hamlet says ends with think about women. They may paint an inch
That's right,
to this end, we may come. So
to
this is the sense of mortality. That is the end of that.
Yes. I mean, as in the case of Montaigne and the Stoical philosophy, too much obsession with transience and with death and so on simply eats away at the sense of life, and the attachment to life, and the commitment to life, at getting on with living.
If you had to pick 2 or 3 books by Goethe, which ones would you pick? Normally I would have asked one, but then I think obviously the answer would have been Faust, presumably. So which
well, I mean, Faust for the beauty, the magnificence of a lot of the poetry, though not for its coherence as a drama, which is highly questionable. I mean, I think ultimately the greatness of Goethe is as a lyrical poet. Books like Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre would not have made such a supreme reputation all by themselves if he'd never done anything but write novels, not even the Wahlverwandtschaften. But as a lyrical poet, he is unsurpassed, unsurpassed in German and possibly unsurpassed across the breadth of European literature. So I would go for the poems. I mean, the great prose text, of course, is Werther. I mean, that is Goethe's best prose, absolutely best narrative prose, and inexhaustible. When you've read Werther, you think you've read a long novel. It's about 100 pages, and that's the density of the experience of reading it, and the density of what is captured in the text. So yes, I mean, I could pick out various poems or sets of poems that rather than individual other works. You know, the Roman elegies, of course, which are magnificent and turn around the whole tradition of love poetry away from loss and lament into positive affirmation. Difficult to write happy poetry. Always people say, you know, happiness hasn't got much to it. Nothing much you can say about happiness. It's misery that's really a serious subject. And of course, Goethe makes happiness a very positive subject and reverses the whole line of development of European political poetry. So that's always been a great favourite of mine.
I'd love to talk about Schiller and Thomas Mann as well, but there isn't time for that.
No.
So let's move on to your other great research interest, which is the Enlightenment. Right. And one of the things you've done is brought out the importance of the German Enlightenment within the European Enlightenment. People are always aware, I think, of the importance of Immanuel Kant, but then the rest of the German Enlightenment kind of has sometimes been underestimated. How do you see the Enlightenment generally, and how do you see the role of the German Enlightenment within it?
Well, just to touch on Kant to start with, I think Kant is more praised than read by ordinary people because he is thought to be so difficult, and he is indeed difficult. A lot of Kant is very difficult indeed, but the basic lines of his argument and his position are straightforward, and they're perfectly accessible. He's sometimes been detached from the Enlightenment because people say, well, Kant put an end to the Enlightenment by introducing such complex thought that nobody could go along with it, so it all came to an end, and the more straightforward Enlightenment thinking was discredited by Kant's profundity, but really he is actually on the same wavelength as the rest of Enlightenment thinkers. That Kant is less well known than it should be because people don't read him. They should at least read the essays, because the essays are the more or less popular presentation of his ideas. Other Enlightenment writers are sometimes known individually, but not necessarily grouped as the Enlightenment. I mean, people don't commonly think of Goethe or Schiller. Lessing they will think of as Enlightenment. Lichtenberg, don't really know where he belongs.
To what extent are Goethe and Schiller, in your view, Enlightenment?
Well, I think they are.
Because if you look at the way they've been perceived generally, then within Germanistic, in German studies, they always say, well, this is Sturm und Drang, and then that becomes classic. In a wider European context, people always say, well, they're romantic writers, but you see them as Enlightenment figures.
I see them as Enlightenment figures. I mean, if you read particularly Schiller's historical works, the revolt of the Netherlands against Spanish rule and the 30 Years' War, they're very markedly Enlightenment works in the basic assumptions behind the narrative. And indeed, both Goethe and Schiller, and I touched on the point of secularity just now, and they are both profoundly secular writers who start off again afresh without being caught up in earlier Christian traditions. That we can bring them together as, in a sense, continuators of earlier Enlightenment thinking, but turning it into wonderful literature. I mean, the problem with Enlightenment ideas is how do you put them across? How do you make them palatable? How do you make them attractive? How do you make them accessible and perspicuous? And the answer is you build them into literary works which embody the values that Enlightenment thinkers held.
So how do you see Goethe as an Enlightenment novel?
No, not really. I don't see Goethe as categorizable in any particular way. It is such a powerful, uniquely powerful work.
One could make the case, of course, that Goethe, the Enlightenment stresses the autonomy of people, and then first of all the autonomy of people as as reasoning beings, as rational beings. And then you could say, well, then if you just take it one step further, then you can say that people are entitled to their own emotions as well. So there's a continuity.
And entitled to do away with themselves. I mean, committing suicide is an ultimate act of freedom, which was very much taboo in the 18th century. I mean, David Hume has an argument about suicide, which he doesn't actually publish, if I remember rightly. It doesn't appear until after his death. And the assertion of suicide and the invitation to the reader to sympathise, to empathise and sympathise with this case is a very powerfully unorthodox position. And to that extent, if you think of the choice to leave this life as the ultimate freedom, then if Enlightenment is for freedom, then that's Enlightenment.
Yeah, and also, of course, the freedom to choose the woman you want, not because of dowry or social status or whatever. So that's the one. So there is this the stress or the emphasis on the autonomy of human beings in Goethe as well. What it doesn't have, of course, is there's no moral message at the end. The reader is completely left to his own devices as to how he wants to read.
How far you sympathise with, yes, that's right. I mean, I think contemporary readers sympathised, It's a myth that lots of people rushed out and committed suicide dressed in similar
Yes.
costumes to Goethe. That's always been alleged, but is not true, not documented in any way. Modern readers don't always take to it sympathetically. We had it on the programme for prelims in Oxford for some years, and a lot of undergraduates thought that Goethe was just a bit of a wimp, and why didn't he get himself together?
Yeah, there will be plenty of reaction in the sense. There were plenty of other fish in the sea. Why?
Yes, that's right. Yes, there'll be another one long like buses fairly shortly. Yes, no, and so he didn't always strike a sympathetic chord with the young. But then
coming back to the moral message, I mean, Lessing, that prototypical
Enlightenment
yes,
that's right.
Said, you know, this is a fantastic novel, but the only thing that's missing is something at the end, which makes it clear that Goethe actually made the wrong choice.
Yes, that's right.
So if Goethe isn't a typical Enlightenment novel, which of Goethe's works do you think are categorizable as expressing an Enlightenment sensibility?
Iphigenia has always been a favourite of mine in that respect, because it shows an individual coming to conclusions, arriving at decisions which are very risky, potentially fatal, handing over the knowledge of what's going on to the king, to us, and gradually working her way towards the freedom to do that. Difficult for her as a woman. Her whole history is one of being subjected to men. She was nearly sacrificed by her father Agamemnon to get a fair wind for Troy. She's rescued by Diana, by Artemis at the last minute, but nobody much knows that. So there she is in Tavis, dominated now by a king who is threatening to reintroduce human sacrifice because things have been going wrong lately. And she's been the one who has, as it were, argued the liberal case for not sacrificing strangers who are washed up on the shore. These two guys who are washed up on the shore are her brother and his friend. So it's a very complicated task to get through that, and ultimately she doesn't go along with the dominance of the males who make an escape plan, because she can't lie to the king, who in many ways has been benefactor. And so she puts it on his lap, in his lap. You know, will he kill them or will he not? So she tells the truth of what they're trying to do to escape with the image of the goddess and so on. And of course it comes out all right. That's what people sometimes object to. You have a happy end, you know, it can't be serious. If you resolve a tragic situation, it's not going the whole hog of literary tragedy, but it's entirely plausible, and it's made, the case is made for enlightenment. She arrives at her own independence of mind, which is the Enlightenment ideal. I mean, Kant's ideal of thinking for yourself and acting freely. And she does it as a woman under more pressures against it than a man would be. So it's a quite wonderful Enlightenment drama. I mean, so in a sense, it is the epitome of Enlightenment principles put into beautiful verse and plausible, believable, credible, tragic. Potentially tragic, and in the end untragic.
We've got a little bit of time, so let's tackle Schiller as well. Is Schiller also an Enlightenment writer in your view?
Yes, I mean, Schiller is not concerned in the dramas to put over ideas in that direct way, but if you think about dilemmas like the dilemmas of Max Piccolomini in the Wallenstein trilogy, that is a young man who comes to his own decisions against all the pressures of intrigue and military action going on around him. An invented character placed in the middle of an action which is made up basically of real historical characters and real historical events. I mean, that might be more or less the nearest case to Iphigenia's self-assertion and arrival at Mündigkeit. Mündigkeit being the classic concept for independence and freedom of mind, the legal term for coming of age. You have to come of age, you have to be prepared to think for yourself. As they say, growing old is obligatory, but growing up is not. You have to be prepared to grow up
and
off your own
initiative. Do you think that
in
the eyes of Goethe and Schiller, literature could play a role in this?
Yes, I think so. Sense? I think so, and not in any, as it were, propagandistic way. I don't think they were in any sense committed to, in any narrow sense, committed to propaganda and propagating ideas, but it's quite clear that they were informed by, their work is informed by the Enlightenment that they grew up in. Schiller, of course, experienced very immediately himself as a young man in his education the pressures of society, the pressures of absolutism, in the way that he was taken over by Karl Eugen and educated in the Duke's institutions in a very, very illiberal way, and in a sense his early dramas are a reaction against that kind of social pressure. The Enlightenment, among other things, is in rebellion against social pressures, against political pressures, in a Germany which is, albeit fragmented, still a system of dominance, of absolutism over the private individual.
Yeah, I mean, in the letters on aesthetic education, Schiller seems to be in a sort of dilemma. If you read the text, it's ambivalent and ambiguous, isn't it? On the one hand, he seems to be saying that freedom can only be had in literature. On the other hand, he also seems to be making the case that literature and freedom in literature could perhaps be a transitional stage towards freedom in society.
Yes, one has to remember that he writes these letters in response to the disaster, as it seems now to be, of the French Revolution, yes, which has raised hopes and then dashed them because it's all turned into internecine conflict and murder from one sect by another within the revolution. He's trying to hold on to the idea that positive Enlightenment thinking can be realised, even though it's not being realised in France as was hoped and expected at the moment. It is now, he says, a job for more than 1 century. So he's picking himself up and dusting himself down and trying to make a new start in an enlightened direction. That's very tough when you think of the disillusionment that was widespread over Europe when the French Revolution turned into the murder of the king and the queen and internecine violence and partisan conflict.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's spend a few more minutes at the end of this interview on your current project. Tell us a little bit about the thing you're working on at the moment and that you gave a lecture on yesterday.
Okay, well, it is called Genesis, an original title that has been used on the odd occasion before, and it really is a set of case studies of how particular works came into being, which has always fascinated me, not just gratuitously as core fancy that, but as a way of understanding a text, to come at it from the way it was evolved, the way it developed, consciously on the part of the writer, less consciously as a consequence of outside circumstances, changes in the culture, changes in the politics, all sorts of factors that come in differently in different cases. And I've always been fascinated by that, and I've always worked on literary works from the point of view of the way they came into being, thinking of that as the way to see something right down from it to its roots, and judging the plant, as it were, with the help of a view of its growth. And so somewhat presumptuously, as I admitted last night, some of my case studies are not Germanic, not German literature. I start off with Homer, and then I work on Montaigne, and then on Shakespeare. I have all those sections written. I shall have to somehow tangle with the Bible, because as it were, the Genesis of the Bible is a whole series of complex cases. And then the second half of the book is German cases. I have a couple of chapters on Goethe written already, one on the poetry, one on Faust, and there's one to come on the novel Wilhelm Meister. And then there will be Georg Büchner and Brecht and Thomas Mann and Kafka, and at the very end a poem by Paul Celan. Mm-hmm. It's a book which is not going to be strong on theory. I'm not going to theorize much, but simply allow the case studies to speak for themselves. It's possible that in a general introduction or an epilogue, some general ideas that link them all together may come out, but the main interest, I hope, for the general reader is aimed at the general reader, what I called yesterday evening the common reader, people who like literature, people who are interested in how it comes about. There's a strong interest in literary biography, in writers' lives and how they came to write things, and I think possibly a set of case studies on major works and how they came into being can be of interest to a general reader.
And looking to the future, the project after that?
Well, the first project is staying alive, of course, at my age, but insofar as there is a project, the notion is to do another comparative work, because there are three people in the 19th century who, in a sense, belong together. Byron, Heine and Pushkin. They are all wits, they are all intellectuals, they are all highly conscious, they are all ironists, they are all involved in politics, they are all sent off into exile in different forms, but they are also all supreme lyrical poets. So there's a lot to be said about them. They're all rather naughty, they're all rather scandalous, and so the book is going to be called Byron's Cousins and Unholy Trinity.
Sounds good. Good luck on both your projects, and thank you for doing this interview. Thanks.
Thanks so much.